Excellent. Thank you. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just one moment. If you are here for our event with Emily Maloney and Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, you are in the right place. We're going to get started in just a couple moments. And first, I wanted to thank you all for joining us this evening and welcome you to this virtual celebration of Emily Maloney's Cost of Living. I'm Car, I'm the events coordinator here for Green Apple Books in San Francisco. As you get settled in, do feel free to hop in the chat, say hello, tell us where you're tuning in from, settle into your seats with a beverage of your choice. Wanted to let you know about a couple of upcoming events that we have. Tomorrow, February 22nd at 7 p.m. Pacific time, we'll be hosting a hybrid event celebrating Isaac Fellman's novel Dead Collections. It's about a queer archivist and vampire, and we are thrilled. Fellman is going to be in conversation with one of our Green Apple favorites, Charlie Jane Anders. That is tomorrow, February 22nd, both in person and online. And this coming Thursday, February 24th at 7 p.m., Sylvia Vasquez Lovato will be celebrating her memoir, In the Shadow of the Mountain, with author Rebecca Handler. It's a marvelously compelling memoir about many things, including Vasquez Lovato's trek up Everest with a group of fellow survivors, and we really can't wait for that as well. Again, Thursday, February 24th at 7 p.m., both in person and online. We do have a full event calendar on our website, which I'll link to in the chat for you folks. And if you've been to an event with us before, you have heard me say, I'm not above it. Please do buy books from us if you can. When you buy books from an independent bookstore, you not only support us in putting on events such as these, but you also support these authors who put so much time and so much of their heart into making these books. And then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So do consider it if you are able. Purchase a book from an independent bookstore. Doesn't even need to be ours, just an independent bookstore. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we will have a Q&A after this discussion this evening here with Emily and Alex. So if you have any questions, do enter them into the Q&A portion of your screen here. It'll either be on the bottom or on the side, depending on your interface. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us this evening. First, Alex Marzano-Lesnevich is the author of The Fact of a Body, a Murder and a Memoir, which received, among many awards, a Lambda Literary Award, the Chautauqua Prize, and the Prix France Inter JDD, an award for one book of any genre in the world, and was named one of the best books of the year by Entertainment Weekly, Audible, The Times of London, and many others. They're the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, McDowell, the Maine Arts Commission, among many others. They are now an assistant professor at Bowdoin College and live in Portland, Maine, with an enormous dog. Please do keep a lookout for their next book, Both and Neither, coming from Doubleday, the gender bending and genre bending work that we all need in our lives. Please do welcome Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. And last but certainly not least, we have Emily Maloney, whose work has appeared in Glamour, Virginia Quarterly Review, Best American Essays, and the American Journal of Nursing, among others. She's worked as a dog groomer, pastry chef, general contractor, tile setter, and catalog model, and has sold her ceramics at art fairs. Maloney has twice been awarded a McDowell Fellowship. She lives in Evanston, Illinois. Her book, The Cost of Living, is the reason we are here this evening. So please do join me in welcoming Emily Maloney. Yay. I'll let you folks take it away.
So should I start by reading?
Please do, yes. Emily, please read.
I'm just gonna do
excited.
like 5 minutes or so. I'm trying to time myself so I don't go over. I'm just going to read from Cost of Living, and we'll see sort of how far I get. I think I can get a few pages in. Okay. In 2008, the hospital where I worked, a level 2 trauma center just outside Chicago, was $54 million in debt. Everyone seemed to be aware of this fact, The figure floated beneath the surface of all our conversations, an unspoken rigidity we seemed to bump up against everywhere we turned. We were to be careful when we distributed small stuffed animals to unhappy children in the ER. We're told to dispense fewer scrub tops to adolescents with dislocated shoulders and bloodied shirts, to pay attention to the way that canes seemed to walk off as if under their own power. Everything cost money, Helene, our nursing manager, reminded us, even if the kid was screaming and had to get staples in his scalp. I was an ER tech then, someone who drew blood, performed EKGs, and set up suture trays. Most of my knowledge of the world of the ER came through direct patient care. If a nurse or a doctor needed something for a patient, I'd get it for them. I'd run into the stockroom, sort through yards of plastic tubing, through dozens of disposable plastic pieces, acres of gauze. We, the techs, were expected to guard against the depletion of resources. Helene seemed to remind us at every available opportunity by tacking notes up on the bulletin board in the staff break room. Please conserve your resources. Only use what is necessary. These notes were pinned to our Prescmini survey results, a form sent to patients upon discharge. Helene blacked out staff names if the feedback wasn't positive. But the question of resources seemed like the kind of problem that couldn't be solved through gauze or surveys or suture trays. When it was quiet, a forbidden word in the emergency department, I'd help with the billing. We'd break down charts as fast as possible, scan them, assign codes, and decide what to charge. Names I vaguely recognized flew by on the PDF reader. I studied my handwriting on their medication lists, a form techs weren't supposed to fill out but did anyway. Nurses were supposed to keep up with the medication lists, but there was never enough time for them to actually do it. Because there were only 20 slots on these forms, I sometimes had to use 2 pages. I was 23 at the time, still paying off the cost of the mental health care debt I took on at 19, a cost I believed I would shoulder well into my 30s, a figure that felt more like a student loan than an appropriate cost for medical care. I didn't understand the nature of my mistake at the time, that I should have gone somewhere else for treatment, maybe the university hospital, where the state might pick up your bill if you were declared indigent, or nowhere at all. Sitting on a cot in the emergency room, I filled out paperwork certifying myself as the responsible party for my own medical care, signed it without looking, anchoring myself to this debt, a stone dropped in the middle of a stream. This debt was the cost of living, and I accumulated it in the telemetry unit, 5th floor, at a community hospital in Iowa City, hundreds of miles from home. There, I spent too much time playing with the plastic shapes that dangled from my IV line, which dripped potassium ions in carefully meted doses, like dimes from my future life funneled into a change counting machine. I couldn't imagine the amount of money I'd spent, the debt I'd incurred, in attempting to end my life. Suicide should be cheaper, I remembered thinking. Probably half the costs were for psychiatry, for an illness it turned out I never really had. I was depressed, but a lot of people were depressed in college, it seemed. I only tried to kill myself after I began taking, and then stopped taking, all the medications I'd been prescribed, 26 in all for what turned out to be a vitamin deficiency, combined with hypothyroidism and a neurologically based developmental disorder. And then there were the unintentional costs, those involving loss of work, lost friends, having to ask my father if he would drive to Iowa City and help me pack up all my belongings and move into a new apartment, since my roommate, who had also been diagnosed with mental illness, had developed a profound depression and moved out. He wanted to drive to Mexico on a motorcycle. My life did not have space for motorcycles. When my bill finally reached me, it wasn't itemized, just balance forwarded from the hospital to the collection agency after my paltry insurance covered the initial cost. From then on, I'd get calls requesting that I boost my payments, or I'd call to switch bank accounts and they'd harass me on the phone. They would call me on my cell phone when I was at work, in the car, at home, in between shifts at the hospital, which I sometimes worked back to back if I could. For a long while, I ignored them. I blocked their number, refused to answer when they dialed. My debt was 5 figures, an immense sum for someone making only $12.50 an hour. My coworkers in the ER were largely sons and daughters of first-generation immigrants. Most of them lived with their parents and made up for it by driving nice cars. I lived in a third-floor walk-up almost far enough away from Iowa City to forget how much money I owed and to whom. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emily. That was stunning. And honestly, I've taught this essay so many times, as you know, and it's such a privilege to hear you read it in your own voice. One of the many things I love about this collection, there we go, is how much your voice shines through in every essay. We always have this feeling that you are talking to us in this great detail, but also this enormous sort of compactive honesty between you and us. And I've watched my students always be really shaken up by this essay, in part because of some of like the personal disclosures you make in this like direct tone, but then the slow accretion of all these costs as you really make us think about what we don't often want to think about, like what it costs to stay alive. We want to think about it as something that transcends cost, and that here it is, the hospital debt, the accounting of the monetary cost of this. And I'm just curious what it was like to write this down. It's such a radically built piece. It really goes through all these details and they accrete like that. What was it like to sort of develop this into an essay? Did you know where it was going?
Yes, but only because there's a woman in my head who tells me what to say and then I write down whatever she says. But a lot of the sections were in the wrong order. I really struggle with the structural aspects, which I think is part of my nonverbal learning disability, sort of my lack of, my lack of ability to sort of organize in the sort of executive function issues that I have. So a lot of the sort of parts of this essay, they were in a very different order. And I had sent this to the editor I had been working with at VQR, Paul Reyes, and Paul. I said, my original piece had not worked out at all. I was supposed to do this big reported piece, and I was supposed to be traveling to West Virginia, and my sources just disappeared. And the piece did too. And so I sent this essay, which was from my MFA thesis, as a sort of consolation prize, like, please take this if you want. Sorry about the other piece. And he said, okay. And he rearranged a lot of the sections at the beginning, I think. The first few paragraphs were there, but then I have this tendency to sort of run off into other directions. So he really helped me organize the beats of it. But in terms of actually putting this piece together, I remember I wrote it initially in my MFA program, and it was called like The Cost of Suffering or something. I had a terrible title, and my professor did not like it at all, and thought it was just not the kind of work that he wanted me to be doing. And we had a big discussion about it. And it was really hard at the time, because I thought, this could be good. I feel like I'm doing, interesting, weird things here. I want to talk about these issues. But yeah, the initial response that I got to this piece when I wrote it was pretty negative. So I just kind of filed it away and then waited for an opportunity to spring it on someone else.
I have so many questions. Okay, first of all, how does he feel now that there's a book out that's getting all this critical acclaim? Have you spoken with him?
Yes.
Okay.
He's recognized that, and he's very supportive now. But at the time, it was, he just thought it just seemed too gruesome or something like that.
That's exactly what's so beautiful about it. Like, you make us think about these things that we don't want to think about. I want to go back to something you said at the start, because I have read, at least, you refer to the woman in your head before, but I'm not sure if all of our audience has. So if you could just tell us a little bit what you mean and what the process of writing is like for you.
Sure. You know, for a long time, I thought I had mental illness, and maybe I still do, but I think that there's this woman in my head, and she tells me what to write down, and then I write down whatever she says. And she has very low regard for my personal well-being. So sometimes, like, you know, I wake up in the middle of the night to work, or sometimes I work very early in the morning, but she's not me. She's kind of mean. And I don't know, she just sort of narrates. And so she's the person who maybe wrote this book. I don't know. She's not really a person either, but she just kind of, she says what I'm doing, and then I write down those things. The benefit is that usually when I've written those things down, I kind of have a sense of where I'm going and what I'm doing. But for a long time, the work exists in my head. I read the pages in my head. I can rearrange things in my head. And her narration, a lot of the time I don't write it down. And then I kind of manipulate the pieces in my head. And then eventually, when things feel like they might be coming together a little bit, that's the point at which I start writing stuff down.
That's fascinating. Okay. And then in this essay in particular, but really throughout the book, you have so much information that you're pulling forth. You give us such precise accountings of costs. You give us such precise accountings of drug names. You give us such precise accountings of even like the shape of different forms and what the fields look like. What was the process like researching yourself for this essay and for the other essays in the book?
Yeah, so I have hundreds of pages of medical records. And so I had that that I had to sort of contend with. I requested all of my hospitalizations. I also had written a lot of these sections that take place in the hospital while I was working there. So some of these sections date to 2008 or so, 2009, when the book started. So a lot of, you know, any of the ER stuff really. And then, you know, I think there are several things that happened. One, cost of living and the piece towards the end, Something for the Pain. Both of those pieces were written for Virginia Quarterly Review, very thoroughly fact-checked. I sent them my medical records and my bills from the collection agency. So I had a very rigorous fact-checking process for those two pieces. And then for the rest, you know, during the process of putting the book together, I had a really, really sharp production editor who made sure that I said what I meant to say. Hannah, she was kind of brilliant and saved me from myself on a number of occasions.
God for editors. You just like named two of the things that most of us would just absolutely cringe away from showing someone else: medical records.
The medical records in my
like
dad.
Yes.
It's true. It's true.
What has this been like for you, this process of not only sharing that with like magazine editors, fact checkers, but now with, you know, the world?
Yeah, it's wild. I think that, you know, the response has overall been really positive, I think. But I've definitely gotten a lot of information about other people's lived experiences. You know, I think you write something really personal and then you end up, you know, receiving stories, and that's okay. You know, I think that's sort of part of the process, I guess. Maybe I'll feel differently, you know, ask me in 6 months. But I think that that experience overall has been good. I think that it's interesting that a lot of people don't understand the difference between this, you know, this character and me. And so there's that, you know, that sort of intimacy where they think, oh yeah, you know, like, I know Emily, I've read her book. And it's like, well, you know, not really. You know, I mean, you met the character Emily, who I carefully constructed and created. You know how it is, I'm sure. But that kind of because there's like, I talked about this a little bit in a previous discussion with someone, but Frederick Reichen wrote this essay about how first novels often fail because the narrator, author, and the character are all the same person, and they just kind of get really flattened down. And I wanted to be really careful when I constructed these essays to make sure that, the narrator, the character is like, dumb meat puppet me, like I'm stumbling through this universe, and I'm naive and I don't really know things. And the narrator is, of course, that person who says, I didn't know then, but I know now, who's going to try and figure out, how to navigate this world. And I tried to be really thoughtful and deliberate in how I constructed both Emily as a character, and then also, the work I did to sort of parent that character along.
I love that term parent, especially because you are so many different ages in the book, or that period of sort of young adulthood. For folks in the audience who may or may not know this essay, Emily, I'm obsessed with this essay, so I'm so glad you just referenced it, the Reagan essay. It was in a very old, like 15 years ago, back issue of the Writer's Chronicle, the AWP publication, and it is super useful, and it is called something like The Author Narrator to Character Split. And he is very cranky in it, but it's very helpful if you are writing memoir or autobiographical fiction. Or
just
essays.
like, I mean, I don't know. I PDF everything, like I have a problem. So, if anyone wants a copy of this essay, just email me and I'll send it to you. But it is, I think, something that it sort of unlocked something in my head, because I think that and Philip Lopate's To Show and to Tell, because I thought, I have to make these choices. I'm making choices about what information I'm divulging and when, and I have to figure out how to construct things so I can build these scenes and build on the ideas that I have and make sure that my ideas come through.
When did you realize that Cost of Living was the seed of an entire book, of a whole collection?
Probably the fall of 2008. I didn't write it, and I didn't really write this essay about my debt. Came about in 2015. In terms of like that last, there's like a last section of that essay where I talk about my debt being forgiven. It's the first essay. I don't feel like I've spoiled any for anyone, but that bit I wrote in maybe fall of 2015. But the other components had been there for a long time. I'd taken a class. I went back to school. I realized I needed to finish my degree, and I went back to school in the fall of 2008, and I took a class at the University of Iowa with Susan Lohafer, who's like this, I don't know, I think like all the books that come out of the nonfiction writing program are like, many of them have had Susan's hand. Like she's emeritus now, but she was like a short story theorist who stumbled into this kind of work, I guess, the essay work. And she was the one who was like, this is just another anecdote from your storehouse.
Oh, wow.
Or something along those lines. She was cutting, but she really sort of explained myself to myself as a writer for the first time. Like I had not really, I couldn't figure out how to write essays. I didn't really figure out how to write essays until much later, but I took this class and she said, your whole shtick is like the world according to Emily. So like, you might as well do something with that. And so I took it and ran with it. So some of the initial pieces from this book, the 3 deaths piece, some of the other scenes are from that class. So that was kind of the impetus.
I want to go back to that moment where the bill collector lets you know that the debt could be forgiven. because one of the things reading that moment is that it feels so arbitrary. It feels like if you'd gotten someone else than her that day, you might still be trying to pay this down, or you might have paid this down for completion. And there's a way in which that moment serves as sort of a gloss over the rest of the book that lets us know how arbitrary or there but for, you know, so many of the moments in the book are. We sort of feel the precariousness of mortality by feeling the precariousness of that moment. And I'm curious how you wrote these moments of chance into the text. Like, chance is sort of arbitrary for an essayist, right? Things happen in life, but they may or may not have meaning in the sort of narrative arc of things. How did you think about where to find meaning in these moments? Were you ever worried about that?
Oh, no. I mean, there's a lot of essays that didn't make it into this book. I probably have like another book of essays that didn't make it in because they're like stubs, you know, they peter out. That happens for me a lot. So I have like, you know, I'll write a few scenes, or I'll say, you know, these are the ideas I want to, you know, work with or whatever. And I start working, and then I file it away. I recently found out that I wrote like a 275-page manuscript in like graduate school that I never did anything with. It's just sitting there on my hard drive. There's like a YA novel as well that I just like wrote and is sitting there. At some point, maybe I'll come back to those things, but like in the meantime, I think that there's this sort of accretion that happens, right? And I think that you know, this essay without that final scene didn't feel finished. You know, I wrote it and I thought, okay, you know, maybe at some point I will stop trying to put a bow on the end of this essay, and it will be, you know, it will grow up and become a real essay, you know. And I sort of just, you know, filed it away with the rest of my thesis, which was titled Amputation for the Greater Good, which included an essay that's not in this book, that was the title essay of the thesis. I think that happens a lot, you know, you sort of try and figure out where you're making meaning, but it does feel random. And I think that for me, the benefit for at least some of the pieces in this book are that I thought, you know, okay, this might be finished, you know, or like I'd come back to it and think, oh, there's this other thing that happened, or, you know, I would have a series of interactions with patients, or I would have a series of interactions with coworkers, and I think, you know, maybe that's something. But it takes me so long, you know, it takes a really long time for me to write, usually, because of that sort of accretive fashion to writing the essays.
Well, you have to wait for that woman to speak. Dude,
Yeah, I mean,
she tells you what to write.
She, to be honest, she will not shut up. I often,
That's awesome.
I often listen to music or play video games, or, you know, I don't hear that voice when I'm on a horse. So I try and spend as much time. I ride other people's horses. I just kind of happened into that, but got really lucky. But those kinds of, you know, and when I make pots, I do ceramics. When I make ceramics, she turns off. But other than that, she's often there. It's very intrusive, but I only write down a fraction of what she says. And so I do accumulate a lot of pages. It's just that, you know, out of the, you know, whatever, I'm like sifting for something. And sometimes things rise to the surface and sometimes not.
Well, to pick up again on that thread of happenstance, like there's such an element in the book of sort of who lives, who dies, like who gets the expensive treatment and who gets the cheaper one, and thus what size debt will they find themselves saddled with, and a patient is so rarely thinking about that. But also like who gets sick and who doesn't. All of that happenstance that is so exacerbated by horrific inequality and access to healthcare, all these issues your book talk about are now issues that so many people are experiencing in a very visceral way with the pandemic. And I know you've written about online, and I did ask you about whether I could ask you about this. You had COVID yourself,
Yes.
and I'm curious how the process of writing this and writing about those issues changed or influenced what it was like for you to now be a patient again, or how does it change the way you interact with the healthcare system?
My husband says I have the opposite of white coat syndrome. There's like this eagerness I have to be good still that's there. So I'm like, I'm going to be a good historian, or I'm going to be a good patient. I don't know. It's a hell of a time having a body, right? Like that's the kind of world we live in. I think that unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize the nature of healthcare inequality until they're unfortunately forced into the situation themselves, right? So, if you're healthy, or if you, don't get sick, there's all these, there are so many different ways to participate or not participate in the healthcare system as a patient. There's everything, I really wish that we just had a single payer system. But there are lots of folks who, participated in a Christian health sharing ministry or something along those lines, where they pay in a certain amount and then they're reimbursed for their expenses. And then, ECMO for your COVID is $7 million. So, that Christian health share ministry isn't going to reimburse those people for $7 million. So I think like at this point we're at, the system is continuing to break, right? We've seen it in terms of shortages of PPE. We've seen it in terms of healthcare resource allocation. We've seen it in people who get vaccinated versus people who won't get vaccinated. That there is this incredible pressure on the system right now. But that pressure has been on the system for a really long time, unfortunately. We've been living, it's just that the experience of the pandemic, I think, has brought to light a lot of these issues that otherwise would not necessarily have come into the public consciousness. They've just, when I was working in an ER, I won't say which one, I participated in a drill where we thought, okay, maybe someone has an anthrax exposure. Let's do this drill. And we had to take care of our own real patients in the ER at the same time that these, model patients would come in seeking treatment following an incident. So we would have this sort of like mass casualty incident where we'd have to tag bodies and bring people in. And there was a decontamination station set up in the emergency room bay, like in the ambulance bay. So people are getting hosed off in the kiddie pool. And, inside the ER, we still don't have medium gloves, like this was in 2008, or whatever. So like to participate in these drills, like we weren't able to take care of our regular patients and also our pretend patients and do a good job. And, that was like the drill, So this problem has been going on for a really long time. And I really do think that unfortunately, as the system continues to break, we're going to see more and more of these shortages, particularly personnel. We don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. We just don't have, we don't have, any of those helping people either, like CNAs or, ER techs. We've run out of those folks as well, medical assistants as well. So unfortunately, things are going to reach and already have reached this sort of critical juncture before we're able to really do something about it.
Are you hopeful that we will do something about it?
I mean, it seems like there are very, the other option is doing nothing. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm like a too earnest Midwesterner, or maybe it's because I'm just a perennial optimist, but I really do hope that we can arrive at some change in the system to help patients and providers as well.
Everyone, Emily and I are going to keep talking for about 10 minutes, but then in 10 minutes, we are going to go to your questions. And I see that we've got one in the chat so far, but I imagine that what she's saying now is sparking a lot of resonances for people. So please, 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 if you've got questions, put them there in the chat and we will pivot to them in about 10 minutes. Have you found yourself thinking a lot about the young ER techs, like maybe who were like young Emily in the past year?
Yeah.
Past few years?
I've been following a lot of people on TikTok who talk about, you know, their lived experience, because the people who are part of that first initial wave of the pandemic, a lot of those folks they have long COVID, they're out of the workplace, you know, they're not working. And then there are people who have continued to work during the pandemic and who are just completely burned out. I know people who have left healthcare altogether, in part because of the sort of inflexibility of and the demands of the system right now. So I think, you know, it's really, you know, I think about renewing my certification and going back all the time. I'm now someone who has sort of fallen down this autoimmune slide. So I have all these other fun diagnoses and illnesses, and I'm not sure if going back to work in that setting during a pandemic is maybe the best choice for my personal health, but I do think about it all the time.
Your style of writing in the book, where you really do sort of layer in, to what's that word, accretion, all the details and the various diagnoses that people have and various treatments and whatnot, for me, they created this sensation reading constantly of an awareness that everyone referred to as real and that they went on. Spread.
Sorry, you just cut out. Can you repeat that last bit?
I think I'm having Bluetooth problems. It really created this sensation for me that I was deeply aware reading that in every essay, the people whose experiences I were reading about had gone on to live whole lives impacted by what I had just read, even though I just met them for a glancing moment on the page. You have a real skill with that. I think it has to do with like the specificity and detail with which you give us, where we know it's real and we know they're going to keep living. And I feel like it also goes back to that moment where your debt is forgiven and we think about, okay, what would have happened to Emily? Like in some ways, this book is maybe possible because of that moment. You get to have this whole other life. And it made me think about the impact you'd like to see. I know we have a question about that in the chat, but I specifically want to know, like, if you could make someone, I read this thinking, I wish everybody with a mortal body, in other words, all of us, would read this and think about what it's describing, because it really makes visceral how much impact arbitrary things have, but then how much impact larger systems have on the individual body, and it's not arbitrary at all in that way. Who would you like to see read it? If you could choose, let's pick anyone in the world. You can pick anyone in the world who you really want to read this, and why, and what would you want them to take from it?
I think I want people who can affect real policy change to read it. I think that there's a disconnect, especially if you have private health insurance and are of means, that you don't understand the sort of day-to-day work of trying to figure out how to live and also especially if you're not someone who's sick or who has ever been sick. I think that, you know, and we've seen this increasingly, you know, stories in places like the Washington Post, where, you know, there'll be someone who was against getting the vaccine, and then, you know, now their wife is permanently disabled and nearly died and was in a coma for several months as a result of having COVID and also being pregnant at the same time. So this is a recent story. And now, you know, he's since gotten vaccinated, she's since gotten vaccinated, and they have tried to get everyone in their church vaccinated. Those kinds of behaviors, you know, where people are not making the change until they see it directly impact them, that, like, if we could just skip that and they could just read the book and have feelings about the book and then go get vaccinated, that would be great. We could just like skip the whole like, you know, ICU stay. It's like, it's really dark of me to say, but that I think that is, you know, unfortunately, they're not really my target audience in the world. So that's why I feel like the policy makers are the ones who are ultimately going to potentially, you know, be able to impact, you know, our healthcare system, because it's so broken, and it's been so broken for such a long time, and the pandemic has just, you know, yes, like we have vaccines now. The virus is rapidly mutating. It's only a matter of time before we have, you know, the next pandemic and the next, you know, this situation of low resource allocation and real strains on the healthcare system. It's not going to go away. You know, it's actually just going to get worse, because we're going to be winded by COVID, and then whatever comes next is going to be far more debilitating, because we've already removed all those workers, you know, from the previous pandemic, unfortunately. So I do think that is going to be, like, ideally, you know, anti-vaxxers, but generally policy people, I think, would be great. Politicians, I don't know.
Everyone, if you know a politician, voice this at them, please.
Please, just send them a copy. I'll sign it.
I love that. I love that plan. I love that plan. I'm already thinking about the people who I'd like to have read it in my life. All right. I want to ask about what's next, because I know that you have really good news to share with us, if you can share it. And I'd love to hear about what's next for you.
Yeah, so my husband keeps joking that I sold a book on a cocktail napkin. But my editor asked me if I wanted to do this again, and I said yes. So I am working on a new book, and hopefully the announcement will maybe come tomorrow. I realized that, I don't know, we submitted it last week, so maybe it'll show up at some point, and it can be more public, but it's called Burn This House Down. And it uses, several years ago, almost 4 years ago now, my brother burned my parents' house to the ground, has no remorse, was booked for felony arson, and then participated in a sort of prison diversion program, the Second Chances program. And I'm using the story of my family as a jumping off point to try and figure out what happened. Where did we go wrong? How did we do this? How did we get to this point? And also just sort of an understanding of how we look at psychopathy in popular culture and media, and also how we treat it in prison, and how we, you know, sort of navigate these different spaces. But it's about that. And I've written a chunk of it, but I'm still sort of, I realized recently, like I put all the words together, you know, you do that, you have like all these, I don't know about you, I have all these documents that are like, you know, save this or whatever, and I open them and it's like, oh wow, you know, I have 20,000 words here. So I've sort of started to work in earnest on it now, and I'm just really excited. It's pretty awesome to get to work with the Holt folks again, and my editor and everybody. So I'm really happy and grateful.
Major congratulations. That's great news for all of us. And I love hearing that you are returning to this very fertile connection between like the personal and the political, the personal and policy, the personal and the larger social. You are so brilliant at that. Your voice just can make those connections seemingly effortlessly on the page, although I'm sure it is not effortless in the writing. I'm curious how you find that ratio when you're writing. Like, do you find yourself go off on a policy rant? Do you find yourself go off on a personal dive? And how do you smooth out the connections there?
That's a good question. I think that the personal is always first. With very few exceptions, I'm not trained as a journalist. I took one journalism school class when I was an undergrad. It was like journalism and law or journalism and policy or something like that. It was like, don't lie or plagiarize, please, if you can. And that was it. So I'm not really, I don't know, I would love, there's a part of me that would just love to write these like, well-researched, thoughtful, beautiful, interview heavy pieces on deadline. But instead I just, I'm weird. And so I write, I write some weird stories about my own experience. And then I go for a walk, or I load the dishwasher. I read a lot. I go into like reading mode, as I'm sure you do too, and just order all the books I can find on the topic. And I spend a lot of time with that. I think with cost of living, I tried to avoid too much of that. I had already read a lot of the sort of medical memoirs, and I couldn't find anything that was representative of my own experience. There are no books written by techs. There's like one book by a paramedic, I think, or something like that. There are lots of illness narratives, some of which are phenomenal, I think, but I couldn't find something that ticked all of those boxes for me. And so I think, and the same is happening with this story, because with the new book, I say, oh, well, this happened. And then people just look at me. But in terms of the sort of personal versus and the political, or the personal and these like research heavy bits, I think that I start with the personal stuff because I know that I know the story, the initial story that I want to tell, and then I build it out depending on the kind of research I have or the kind of work I want to do. And so, yeah, I mean, I ordered my old EMT textbook off the internet, the same edition I had, so I could read it. It's like 900 pages long. There's no reason for me to read it, but I just thought I would get something more out of it. And it did. It brought to the surface some of the vocabulary I had used before, some of the stuff that, if you're not using it every day, you don't necessarily remember. And so those were some of the ways in which I was able to sort of dive back into that kind of research, or the bigger picture stuff too.
That's fantastic. Since we are on the topic of writing, I'm going to go with the writing question in the chat, and then we'll go to the others. So Margaret asks, would love to hear you all talk about revision. Emily, you mentioned an editor helping rework an essay. Do you have any revision strategies you use when there's not someone around to help you get an outside perspective?
Yes. I should say that my husband and my agent are my first editors. And I'm very, very, very lucky in that regard to have people who read my work. But I do a lot of stuff by myself first. And I lay out the book or the essay, whatever it is, to make it look like a book. You can mess with the margins in Word. It's kind of fun. So I do that. And I also look at things like, I'm a big fan of printing out all the sections and then cutting it up and rearranging it. And then the dog comes in and then rearranges it again. So having a dog can be an instrumental part of your process. I joke, but it's super useful. I go for a lot of walks. When I'm thinking about an essay or working on an essay, loading and unloading the dishwasher, taking a shower, taking a nap, solve a lot of problems in my sleep. Those are all things that I try and do. I think the biggest thing for me is because of my disability, I'm wired for sound. So everything in this book is meant to be said aloud. And I was really lucky I got to do the audiobook too. And that was like, I don't know, I want to like run away and become a professional audiobook narrator. It was amazing. But that is another thing, to read it aloud to yourself, and also to use the adaptive technologies on your like Word or whatever, or your Mac, or there's different ways you can have a robot read to you, which is also sometimes useful because the robot trips on words that you might not. Or if you like, I read, when I read stuff aloud to myself, I get bored sometimes, and I think, oh, that's not a good part. I'll cut that part. So yeah, those are some of the things I do.
How do you know when it's done?
Hmm?
How do you know when it's done?
That's a good question. I think at some point I just sort of give up. When I'm really sick of it, that's sometimes when things get done. When I have sort of had to deal with stuff and it's been frustrating. But yeah, that's sort of, yeah. Like if you're really sick of it, take a break. And if you are still sick of it, it's either done or it's very much not done. I've found there's like very little in between, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. Evan in the chat says, I have just started reading and it's been super impactful. Thank you for sharing your experience. Is there something in particular you hope your book will affect? And do you think it's achieving it so far?
Good question. My goal has always been to participate in a conversation about how broken healthcare is and how we really need a single payer system. So that's sort of my soapbox a little bit, is that I really feel like we live in a country where I think naysayers say that it can't be, it'll be so much more expensive, but our current system in many ways subsidizes like drug development in the US because it's so lucrative, subsidizes drug spending in other countries. That's pretty common. But I do think that we need to do something. We're at a point where it can't actually cost anymore. We're at the limit. We're at the limit. People are getting, insane bills, and we're just at a point where something has to change. And so I hope to, in writing this, that people can see that, who may not necessarily see that, people who aren't necessarily associated or aware of the situation can become aware of it.
Evan, again, thank you, Evan, for these questions. How asks in the chat then, I think this leads into nicely, how do you think we, and with that, they're saying individually and collectively, should approach systemic problems like what you've just illuminated for us? What can we do individually? What should we be pushing for collectively? You mentioned single payer healthcare. What can those of us in this chat room do?
I mean, like, I don't know what it was about going to graduate school, but like, I'm ready to bomb banks, not literally, but like, something needs to happen. We need to I think that most of the mass change that we see, particularly in Europe, happens because the French are really good at setting cars on fire and like taking to the streets. And I think Americans need to be better at that. I think that really we're at a point where this is untenable, and we need to participate in like a collective and national sense to try and do things. I think we have, there's like write your senator, you know, there's like that level of action, and like that's good, but like I think we need to really kick it up a notch in order to, you know, I'm not exactly advocating anarchy, but you know, I just feel like we're at a point where something has to happen if we want to move forward.
One hopes that the last 3 years of our lives have woken up people to the idea that something has to happen. And I hope your book does the same, wakes people up to it, because I think it's impossible to step away from your book without realizing that something has to happen. Okay, last question. I'm going to ask you for some reading recommendations for all of us, Emily. What should we read in addition to right now, and you should all order it if you haven't already, Cost of Living?
Ooh, good question. I read a lot of fiction. I am lately obsessed with The School for Good Mothers by Jasmine Chan. I need more people to read it so I can talk about it with them, because it's so distressing. I really feel like there should be I'm not a parent, but I feel like there could be a mother's book group or something. It could, and Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder is another one. It's about sort of figuring out how to be an artist, I think. It's about a woman who might be turning into a dog, who's also a mother of a toddler. Those kinds of books really, I don't know what it is. I'm currently reading High Risk Homosexual because it's Edgar Gomez, and I are doing a reading at AWP together, and it's amazing. I just started. It's so glittery. It's like it's gritty and real and crazy, and there's just like, I don't know, the way he does dialogue is like, it's just like so good, so good. So there's different things. I think you know, in terms of reading healthcare, there's lots and lots of really good books out there about sort of the situation we're in, that have come out in the last few years, but most of them are more policy focused, and I'm really more interested in reading beautiful language.
And thankfully for that, we have your book and all of its beautiful, beautiful, meant to be read out loud. Thank you for reading to us language. So I think we are pretty much out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much I'm so appreciative of your time and your insights, and I'm so appreciative of our very attentive audience, and for their great questions. Emily, congratulations, twice over now that we have a new book to look forward to. Alex, very much looking forward to your forthcoming book as well. So you'll have to, yeah, we do. But I just wanted to say thank you and good night to you both, and to all of you out there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.